Cress Dondi.
It's showtime.
Is it?
It did.
Oh, look! That snuck up on me like that.
It said it's showtime in little letters.
Oh, way up there. Okay.
Calling Chris Anderson. Where are you this week? You keep traveling.
I do.
Can't keep track of you.
Well, I'm in Luxembourg City, and you?
I am 2 feet on your left.
Oh, in Luxembourg. It's
in
like
Luxembourg
a suburb
City,
of Luxembourg.
In Luxembourg City. Okay. We're on day 312 of the Band of Brothers tour. Hey, but let me show you, those of you who got here on time. Last week we had Robert Edsel on, and he was talking about the Margraten Cemetery, and we were there yesterday. So we were at the Margraten Cemetery, and then somebody who has been very involved in the Margraten story and who has been on our show is Sebastian Vonk, who is having a hair moment.
He is having a hair moment. So the wind went just behind him.
But my hair is greased down.
Right, and I have no hair.
Yours is under a hat. No, you have lots of hair. Your hair looks great. Your hair is under a hat. But it's great to see Sebastian.
It was.
It's great to be at Margraten. Welcome, everybody, to History Happy Hour. Thank you to Stephen Ambrose Historical Tours for their support and assistance. Check out their rich offering of military history tours at stephenambrosetours.com. And whether you're watching live, watching on Encore episode, or listening in your car to the HHH podcast, we are glad you're here. And today we are going to be talking about the connected stories of a pair of World War II navigators from the same small town. So, Chris, I want to thank all of our Patreon supporters, especially our top shelf supporters. And
there's an announcement.
Well, first of all, I added Ann Ballard Bryan because I promised I would do so. And I added somebody else here, too. I think, no, I can't remember the person's name, but I added somebody else, too. But I've been taking some people off because
they've disappeared.
They're not, they're no longer. So if you don't see your name up here and you think you're a top shelf patron,
and know you still want to be,
and if you still want to be, you need to come back and make that happen. And you should check next week too, because I think there's going to be another half dozen names that we lose. Next week.
That means we'll have all that much more space again.
Yes, that's the good news. We're making more space for other
viewers
names.
like you.
Yeah. So, Chris, do we have anybody watching here
We
today?
do indeed. We have Lizzie Borden, who seems to be enjoying a very nice glass of wine.
Nice.
Doug McCord from Chester County, where Washington lost at Chadds Ford, hooray, then set up his headquarters at Parker's Ford.
Okay.
And by the way, Doug, I want you to know that I got my delivery from Rick, and I want to thank you very much for the books. And once this is over, I'm going to look forward to digging into the book on Gibraltar. So thank you for that.
And bunches of other people here too. So we should probably, if you want to give me a signal, and if you've got the you-know-what ready.
I do. Fingers or bell first?
Okay. Fingers first.
Nothing happened. No sound effects.
Turn your volume up.
I did.
Try it again.
All right.
Yeah. Okay.
I thought I had a special.
That department is that's moving over to my side.
Let's go with the former top shelf.
Okay. Yeah. Today we're going to explore the story of two B-24 navigators from the same Illinois town who find themselves over Ploesti in a bombing raid at different times, I might add. And we're going to meet the woman who kind of connects them. And our guest is Jan Cress Dondi. Sorry, Jan. And she is the author of The Navigator's Letter, the true story of two World War II airmen, a doomed mission, and the woman who bound them together. The type is small. I can't read. I want to say that Jan graduated from the University of Georgia. She has spoken about her father's POW experience at the U.S. Embassy in Bucharest, recounted her uncle's mission experience in Washington, D.C., and flown in one of the only B-24 Liberators still operating. This is her first book. And so, Jan, we want to welcome you to History Happy Hour.
Thank you for having me here. I'm excited.
Well, good. Well,
we're so thrilled. Did you by any chance, bring a cocktail today?
You know what? I saw History Happy Hour, and Happy Hour has to have a drink. So
Absolutely.
I brought the Navigator with me. It's a
Yeah.
great mix of vodka and pomegranate juice and cranberry, and I've got a little orange peel in there.
Yes.
Ooh.
We actually, everybody, we were speaking before the show, and we were complimenting her on, like, this is kind of an out of sight cocktail, way above our standards.
Yeah. So what are you drinking today?
Well, much like you, Rick, I'm drinking a beer, but it is Franziskaner Weiss beer. Yeah, so,
It's a local beer.
yeah. Cheers.
Cheers. I'm not sure, but anyway. So Jen, you're thinking by now the show's half over, and they haven't asked me a question yet. So let's just start with what I hope will be an easy one, which is what inspired this book, and why is it called The Navigator's Letter?
That's a great question. What inspired this book? I discovered probably 500 or 600 letters in the basement, and the letters were from my two characters, John B. and Bob, back home, and to Polly. And reading through this piece of history, I felt like I needed to do something with it. Originally I made a story for my cousins, and one of my cousins said, "Hey, Jan, this is a really good story. It takes the whole Ploesti campaign from the beginning to the end." And so I did a lot of research, a lot of travel. I probably looked at 100,000 documents in the National Archives and blended them with the letters together with the ride on the B-24, which was pretty awesome. I'm glad you mentioned that.
Yeah.
It was awesome. Wanted to see.
Where did you sit on the B-24? Where were you seated?
I actually could move around the plane. They started me out just in, we had about 10 people on it. The same number of crew members would have been on it, not counting the two pilots. Originally I sat for takeoff. We sat up near the Bombay. But then as we were up, we could move around, and I moved into the nose because I was most interested in the navigator's position. He's got the bombardier there, and the nose gunner is in this tight glass greenhouse. And, then I would go up to the pilot and say, "Hey, how fast are we going?" And we really only went to a level of 2,000 feet over the Everglades. So it was just kind of a 30-minute, 45-minute ride. But it was awesome to understand how cold it could get at altitude. The waist windows are open so the machine guns can shoot the enemies, and it's just thin aluminum skin. So the ride, it really gave me perspective, as to what it was like to be on a bomber. Now, I can't imagine up at altitude, 25,000 feet. That would be a whole different story.
So, Jan, we're going to get into more of the details as we go forward, but maybe you could introduce us to the three young people who are at the center of the story, and kind of explain a little bit about their background and where we're coming from here. Okay.
So John B., there are three of them: John B., Bob, and Polly. John B. is my mother's brother, right there. Bob is my father, and Polly is my mother. There's Bob. And John B., they all grew up born and raised in Hillsboro, Illinois, which is a town of about 4,000 people. Tiny, tiny little town, but a lovely town. During the 40s, they had 2 movie theaters, 3 banks, a couple of 2 newspapers. So for a town of 4,000, it was quite an educated town. John B. went to University of Illinois. He graduated and went on to Kent School of Law. So he became a lawyer and came back to Hillsboro to practice when he was called to serve. Bob was also born and raised pretty much in Hillsboro, but he was the son of a dairy farmer. So he was living outside of town by about a mile, but he went to school in town, and that's how he befriended John B. and Polly. To make this more complicated, Polly's twin brother was Bob's best friend. So Bob really spent a lot of time in Polly and John B.'s home growing up. And Polly sort of looked at Bob as more of a brother figure than a love interest. She had, Polly was a devil-may-care spirit. She had lots of boyfriends. Bob's never really made it on that list. And she was the recipient of many of these letters. The way she supported the war effort was she would bake cookies and send them to a lot of her beaux overseas. So she was full of gossip. And when Bob and John B would write her, much of their letters were about who's dating who's getting married, what are you eating these days, or, whatever. So those are sort of the mainstay of the three characters. Back to Bob a little bit. I think I jumped from him. He was a son of a dairy farmer, worked very hard. He was very smart in math and science, which is probably why they put him as a navigator. He was fluent in German, and he was the 1940 national trombone solo champion.
There you go.
And so that was sort of his claim to fame. He was going places. He was as a sophomore in college, he was studying to be a lawyer. So he was on track to be a lawyer, but then he was called to serve when he was a sophomore.
Okay. So one of the things that I found fascinating is that you really dive into the details of what it's like to be a navigator, and really get into what the navigator is doing. It struck me that you're really trying to capture that experience, not simply in combat, but in training, etc. So give us a sense of what the navigators are doing and why, at least in the eyes of Jan Cress Dondi, it's clearly the most important position on the airplane.
So you want on the airplane, what they do, all right, they're in this glass greenhouse in the nose of the plane. They're turned backwards. Their back is to the front of the plane. So they're actually looking at the feet of the pilots up in the cockpit. So they have a pull down table. It's just like a piece of plywood on a piano hinge, a pull down table. They stand throughout the entire mission because there's not really any room to take a seat there. They have boxes of bullets, what do you call the
links of ammunition, the belts?
Yeah, in next to each foot. So he doesn't really have a lot of room to move around. He, at takeoff and landing, he goes upstairs to the cockpit because he would sort of help the pilot count off the speed to liftoff. So he sort of helped the pilot in that regard. And then he would go back down from the cockpit through the radio operator's desk, a step down from the cockpit. And then he had to crawl through a small tube that was probably 3 foot square to get to the nose. He couldn't walk straight to the nose. You had to, at least when I was on there, you had to hand on your hands and knees and crawl into the nose. He would take star sights. He had a bubble above his sight in the nose of the plane. There was a bubbled globe that he could take star sights and look out and do some of his navigation. He used an E6B. It was like a slide rule for flying. I think pilots can actually use it today, the same thing that they used then. I don't, it's so complicated. I don't know how they figured out what they figured out. I mean, honestly, there was no GPS then, and they counted on the stars at night to get them across. Bob's story of going across the ocean is just as hairy as John B's. John B took the northern route. Bob took the southern route. The northern route, John B got about halfway over from, I think they took off of New Hampshire and went by way of, they were headed to Prescott, Scotland. Yeah. And so as they got toward halfway mark, I guess, maybe over Greenland or Iceland, the compass is affected by the North Pole. So they're headed straight to the North Pole where they're not supposed to be. And the pilot calls down to John B and says, "Hey, are you sure we're on target?" And John B looked out the window and he was in disbelief. His compass had gone crazy, had gone fluey, and they were headed directly to the North Pole, which they would have run out of gas and, it would have been the end. But they made an immediate 180, and so he could get to Scotland and landed fine. They were actually the 6th B-24 to land in England, Alconbury, England. Bob's mission was from the southern route where they went by way of South America, and he encountered hurricane force winds. There were no clouds. There was the Black Sea below them. He was sort of guesstimating until he could get an opening in the cloud covers. And when he did take a star sight, his stars were off the chart. So it's very complex, but he ended up landing right on the nose, so it's a difficult thing. I mean, I drive GPS all the time.
Would you want to ask? So yeah, so just kind of picking up on that, Jan, we had a kind of a further question about the Navigators, and this is from Doug McCord, who's a longtime viewer and always very curious, and he wants to know. He said that I read that Navigators were selected as they were the brightest, even surpassing the pilot. Is that true from your research?
So from my research, the pilots were commanders. They were leaders. And as George Bush said, the presidents are sometimes they're C students because they're smart. Because they can handle things under pressure. And I think the pilot, they were the commander of the ship. The B-24 is not an easy plane to fly, especially at low altitude. So the navigator and the pilot often became best friends because the navigator had the brains, the pilot had the brawn, and they could work it together. Bob and his pilot Jack were roommates together, and they always went on little outings when they were given free time. They would go on outings together, just like John B. and Hugh Roper. They were very tight, and they would go to Felixstowe when they were in England and have a weekend there. And so they were very close because they almost had to read each other's minds to know exactly. They just had to be in sync. And I think they were the most important people on the ship, although the gunners were pretty important too.
Right. Yeah.
So you asked Doug's question. Did you have your own question?
Yeah, well, I was just going to say, John, he obviously, graduates, becomes a navigator, but he's in some of the earlier missions of the 93rd Bomb Group. So maybe, he's a pretty experienced pilot by the time of navigator, by the time of Ploesti. So what has he been up to when he gets to England? I know you talked about January 2nd, 1943, which is the very first mission in Germany. What are some of his early experiences?
He had some crazy experiences because he did not, at that time, they did not have the fighter support that they had later on. So they were going on missions with no fighter support. The enemy fighters were going twice the speed of the bombers. The bombers were going about 165 usually. The fighters could go almost 400, I think, miles per hour. Yeah. So some of his hairy missions in the beginning, they were usually the longest missions. They would try them out on long missions. They actually went through a series of learning curve because they were the first B-24s in combat. So they did diversion missions, which is where they would divert the enemy fighters, try to lure them to follow them so that the B-17s could do their job and drop the bombs. The B-17s were always glad to see the B-24s come along because the fighters would go after them. One of his flights, he was jumped by 60. There were 60 fighters in the area, and his plane was jumped by several. In fact, one of the, I can't remember if it was an ME-109 or an FW-190, came head on to their nose just before breaking away. And they're shooting to kill as they're coming to the nose of the plane. They also know, the fighters know to shoot the gas tanks because then the plane, would blow. But they took them through all kinds of missions, low-level missions, moling missions. They had new radar, and that was the January 2nd mission that you mentioned, January 2nd, 1943, where it was a fly blindly so that you could drop the bombs. So you could drop the bombs with cloud cover. So you wouldn't be seen, you might be seen by radar, but the spotters that were ahead of time couldn't call ahead because they couldn't see them. They might hear them. I mean, it's hard not hearing 100 bombers getting up into rendezvous. So they were often, they knew they were coming.
Yeah.
So your book, a central part of your book is Ploesti, okay? Because you describe, as your story unfolds, there's two different navigators at two different times who are on missions over Ploesti, and they both run into a lot of trouble there. So I'm not sure everybody in the audience knows exactly what Ploesti is, and can you kind of give us a sense of its importance and therefore the dangers that pilots encounter trying to go there?
So Ploesti was Hitler's primary fuel source. There are estimates I found in the early days before they actually did the target. They said it provided 60% of the fuel source to the Nazi machine. You know that tanks don't fly, tanks don't roll, ships don't sail, and planes don't fly without oil. And Ploesti produced a high grade, high octane fuel for their Air Force, as well as a lot of other fuel. So the Allies, Churchill and FDR actually met at the Casablanca conference in January of 1943, and they thought we got to hit the oil at Ploesti because we can shorten the war by 6 months if we can take them out. So that's when the idea of tidal wave, which was a low altitude, it was actually a zero altitude. That's 50 feet to 150 feet above the ground. And what they would do, they felt like that was going to be under radar. They would be able to drop the bomb spot on, and this is to shorten the war. But unfortunately, through the tidal wave mission, if you want me to go there, is that
sure? Sure, please go.
So the tidal wave mission, what they decided was they needed 3 experienced bomb groups from England. England had the most experienced B-24 group. The B-24 was the only plane that could go the long distance, carry a heavy bomb load, and then come back. But even that was kind of iffy whether they could do it. So they loaned 3 bomb groups to the 9th Air Force out of Africa. They had 2, the 9th Air Force had 2 B-24 groups that would go on. So they had 5 groups of B-24s that were going to take off from Benghazi, go north to Ploesti. They turn at the island of Corfu, they were flying at 9,000 over the ocean, the Adriatic Sea, and then they had to climb over the Albanian range. Once they got over the Albanian range, they sort of skirted alongside the mountainside and got down to 200 feet above the ground. Now, if you know anything about flying, it's very difficult to fly a plane at that low altitude. My husband flies a plane, and we often go on little jaunts, and he just wants to get to altitude as fast as he can taking off, because the thermals make a plane unsteady if you're too low to the ground. So one amazing feat was the fact that they were able to fly these planes from the Albanian range toward the Danube at 200. At the Danube, they went down to, say, 100. They were stacked formation, so it was 50 feet, 100 feet, 150. So, but they didn't go over 150. They tried to stay at that range. So as they're approaching the first initial point, the IP, which is where they're supposed to make their turn, or they're supposed to recognize it, the lead group, which was a 9th Air Force group, made a wrong turn. John B's group was right behind them. The 3 other groups had dropped back probably 50 or 60 miles. And because this was under radio silence, they couldn't call the guys behind and say, hey, guys, hurry up, let's catch up. So they were sort of on their own. So the first group, the 376th, made the wrong turn, and the 93rd followed them because the first group had the lead commander showing the way, and the navigator, the lead navigator showing the way. So John B's group turns behind them, but then all of a sudden they realize they turned at too soon. And the 93rd, it was between the navigators and the pilots. And then finally a navigator or someone broke radio silence and said, wrong turn, wrong turn. So the 93rd, the 376th, the first group kept going toward Bucharest. John B's group made a left turn north toward Ploesti. And to give you an idea, Ploesti was a ringed with a fortress with the heaviest fortifications. The 3 groups that dropped back behind were coming from the northwest, which they were supposed to do. But when John B's group followed the wrong turn and then made the correct turn, they were coming to the southern defenses, which is where Gerstenberg, who was the commander of the Luftwaffe at the time, had fortified the southern the southern sector, the strongest, second only to Berlin. They had 88 cannons. They had machine guns hidden in haystacks. They had barrage balloons. The southern sector was where they wanted to avoid. The Allies wanted to avoid it, which is why they were coming around from the northern sector. So as John B's group is going into the smoke and as they're going over there, they're dropping bombs of opportunity. They've already lost sight of what their refinery was. Each of the 5 groups were assigned certain refineries because there were probably 8 or 10 refineries in the Ploesti complex. So they're going in and they're just dropping the bombs of opportunity. As they're going in, the 3 other groups are coming opposite from them. So you've got black smoke, you've got fire, you've got chaos, and 2 American groups facing each other, crossing, and they can't see them until they're right on them. So it's no wonder 165 planes actually made it to the target, and they lost 54 planes over that target. That's nearly a third of all the planes that went off. John B's group, because they faced the southern sector, they lost half their planes, half of their group's planes. So I think they suffered, of all the groups, the 93rd suffered the most. And as a result, John B went missing on that initial tidal wave raid.
Well, and I want to bring in, though, at this point, you have 2 other characters. So John B's gone missing. What is the reaction to Polly and Bob? I mean, how are they hearing about this? Did they comment on?
Yes,
what
Bob. Amazingly, Bob, as soon as Polly found out that John B was missing in action, and what they did, they sent a telegram to John B's parents, and they, of course, were in disbelief, but the whites were optimists, and so they knew the idea. There were parachutes that they had counted from the mishap. So they believed that John B could have been one of those several parachutes that went down, but they didn't know because they went down over enemy territory. Right. And so they couldn't really get a good count. They had been instructed on how to get to the underground. The airmen had been instructed, you get to the underground whatever way that you can, and then they'll get you back to Allied territory. So that's what but sometimes it took 9 months to get them back to Allied territory. So Polly knew immediately, because the information came through the family fast. She wrote Bob because she knew Bob was a B-24 navigator, and she thought, I've got to tell him because he's, sort of part of the family. And so Bob made it his mission to try to find out as much as he could about the Ploesti raid, in hopes to find out where John B was, what was being done to get him, and everything else. So for several months, John B was just missing. There was no answer. Red Cross hadn't written back anything. The family wrote, the governor of Illinois, they wrote a senator of Illinois, they wrote everybody that mattered to find out, you've got to find this crew, because neither crew, nobody knew where they were. So anyway, then Bob has gone through, is actually in training stateside, and he's about to go over to Italy. And then he's the first of his bomb group to go over there. And he's assigned to Ploesti, and he knows how bad Ploesti is. On his first visit, he flew to Ploesti, and the flak that they encountered, as he described, you could almost walk on it. It was just puffs of shrapnel across the sky. And a bomber has to fly right through those, because your wingman is, right on your wingtip. So you can't move to avoid the flak. A direct hit by flak can send a plane down. So on his first mission to Ploesti, he came back, and one of the letters that he wrote back home was, I've been to a place that John B was last seen. I don't care to go back there ever again. Well, Bob was where John B, John B, over the course of 9 months, he had 25 missions because of rain and everything like that, the bad weather in England. When Bob started, he flew almost daily missions. So on his 20th mission out of 30 days, he flew Ploesti. And on that trip, he was also shot down and went missing in action.
He's shot down over Ploesti, and you, of course, described this whole mission in great detail. You've obviously looked at every single record, every single letter he sent, all this stuff. And he parachutes into Romania. And maybe you can talk a little bit about that experience. My impression, reading your book, was that the Romanians seemed, they're allied with Germany at this time. They
Correct.
seem a little bit confused about which side they're on, or maybe ambivalent. I'm not sure what the answer is there. It's quite a mixed reception that they get.
Definitely. Actually, when he was captured, and as the crew started to get together, all captured, the people out in the country were sort of nice to him. They looked at them as rock stars. Bob happened to look like the king of Romania, so they would point to him like, "Wow, he looks like the king." And when his crew got wind of that, they gave him a lot of flack just because they were teasing him. But they treated these men, the officers, I'll say the officers, not so much the enlisted men. They had great respect for officers. So the first 2 days when Bob was in captivity, it was kind of a gentle captivity, if it can be, because he could talk. He spoke German. He didn't speak Romanian, but some of the Romanians could speak English because many of them were related to English refineries that, like, I think Standard Oil was British. It might have been American, but there were a couple of British oil fields. So a lot of the people from the country worked at the oil fields, and they looked up to Americans and the English, the British. And but as he was taken into town where they had bombed out, by accident, a hospital. They hit a hospital. It's not accurate bombing when you're 24,000 feet high. Even though they say you can hit a pickle barrel, you can't. You drop them, and unfortunately, they hit bad places. So as he's coming in, the squaddies that were driving them, the Romanian drivers who were sided with the Nazis, they would put them on show, and these people would these people that had been bombed were throwing sticks and spit, and it was a fearsome ride into town because they were trying to humiliate these airmen and scare them to death. And so once he got into the first holding area, that was much better than the drive into town. Because Bob was an officer, he was treated a little bit better when he was interrogated by the Aryan officer. He also knew what the Aryan officer was saying to his buddy because Bob understood German, but Bob would only release name, serial number, and rank, or whatever you're only supposed to tell. But he was intrigued with the Aryan officer that was interviewing him because he knew English and spoke it well, and had actually, he told Bob, "I did my training in language at, I think, the University of Chicago or somewhere in one of those." And, Bob was intrigued by the fact that they had a folder on each of the guys, or at least the officers, I guess. And I don't know how they got that information. I'm sure there are spies all around southern Italy. There were definitely spies in North Africa buying and selling information. But he said he was amazed at how much the guy knew about him. But it could have been maybe the accent. Maybe he knew the accent, and he was sort of guessing at some answers, hoping Bob would release information.
So Jen, I want to back up a bit though. Rick got our hero shot down a little early for me. So one of the things that's very interesting in the book is, when you talk about that mission that he's on, you talk about a Lieutenant Eric Goering, who is obviously the person, as you reveal, who shoots down the plane. How did you find that name, and how do we know what we know about Goering?
And how do we know that what we know is the truth?
How do we know? Because I'm not telling you. I'm telling you the straight skinny. So I went to probably my first research trip, and we're talking 2012. I had befriended. I went to Bob's POW reunion convention because I wanted to meet some of these guys and learn. Bob had already passed away. And it was after I found these letters. And so I went to the reunion and I said to one of the daughters of one of the fathers that was a POW there, I said, if you ever want to go to Romania, I would love to plan a trip there. Well, she was an A-type personality. She planned a trip to Romania for 5 POW children and our spouses. And it was my sister. So we had 2 POWs. And our husbands. We went to Romania. We met with an aviation archaeologist. He knew exactly where I'd communicated with before we went over there. I told him what I knew about the plane, as much as I could tell him what Bob's impression was as to where he was shot down. And he was able to pull up documents. The Germans kept a lot of records. And he was able to tell me the pilot that took credit for shooting down Bob's plane. And that was worth everything in the trip. I mean, it was just amazing because I wanted to meet this guy. So we come back to America. I'm doing everything I can to find out where this guy is. But the German archives, you need a date of birth, where he lives, that kind of stuff. So we couldn't get anything online. So about 2 years later, my husband is of Swiss descent. And so we always went to Switzerland to visit family. So I said, why don't we drive up to Freiburg, Germany? I'd like to see if I can get into the archives and get the records. And so, okay, it was a 2-hour drive. So we went up there. There's barbed wire around, high fencing and barbed wire around the archives. It's sort of like the Gestapo. So we go to the guard gate, and I said, I'd like to get into the archives. And the guy said, do you have an appointment? And I said, no, but I'm from Florida. Of course you want to let me get in. And so he said, my husband's
tried that.
My husband's translating, and that still didn't get me in from Florida. And so then I said, but for the humanity of a German pilot, I wouldn't be here. So so my husband is translating this story, and I'll tell you the story. It's a little story in the book. So Bob's plane has been shot to hell. He's a hydraulic line burst. It caused a huge fire. A second fire caught on. They were telling Jack, the pilot, and Bob, the navigator, were getting everybody off the plane while Bob's fighting fires, trying to get through to the Bombay, the guys to get through to the Bombay to bail. He's telling Jack, get out. You got it. This thing's going to blow in a minute. So Bob jumps, hoping that Jack makes it, but he doesn't know. Bob doesn't know. It was his first time jumping. They'd never trained him how to jump. So Bob he's blown his parachute up. He's flying down there. He's floating. He sees an ME-109 coming back at him. He had heard stories that they used target practice of Allied airmen, their parachute. And so Bob's thinking, I'm dead meat here. He's going to shoot me and I'm going to die to my death, fall to my death. But it's no better than a burning plane, because So he said, I'm just going to turn and face this guy. I mean, what else can I do? So Bob faced this ME-109 that was coming toward him. As he got close, the ME-109 dropped underneath him. And if you know, the canopy of an ME-109 is clear. The pilot looked up at Bob, saluted him. Bob looked down, dumbfounded, thinking, did that guy have a smile on his face? But the guy just flew underneath him. It sort of pulled Bob's plane or his parachute kind of crazy. But for that act of humanity, Bob survived at least the parachute. So the guard gate guy let me in. He said, go in. So he let me in. And I went to the archives. It was upstairs. And I was able to get Eric Gehring, which is kind of like John Smith. It's a common name in Europe, in Germany. And I was able to get his dossier. My husband, along with a friend, could help us translate it. And I actually had, this is the interesting thing, an Australian historian overheard me what I was looking for. And I said, I don't understand this word. And he understood it. He said, this pilot, and I already knew he was in the same area with Bob. I knew that. But he said, this pilot in early January was in the Bay of Biscay at the same time John B. was there. And I couldn't get any proof that they connected, but they were in the same skies. And the Australian historian told me it was a very big battle with trying to get the submarine pins and all that. So I can't corroborate that he was with the German pilot was at John B.'s neighborhood, but the coincidence is just uncanny.
Yeah.
Yeah, and if they connected, it probably wouldn't have been a really friendly connection.
Oh, that's okay, yeah.
Probably not.
Right.
Right. So your story starts with the training. It goes all the way through to the raid on Ploesti. Continues on with Bob's experience with the folks down there as Romania is being liberated by the Soviets and such. But one of the things that really hit me reading this book was both in training and in combat, how relentless the experience was for the plane crews. I mean, just from the very beginning that they're getting into class. Were you surprised by this? Did you have this feeling also? How did that strike you?
Definitely. So when I started this, I didn't know a lot about World War II. I didn't know about flying in a bomber. I even though I can get into another story about that, but even though I sort of knew a lot of stuff my entire life, I didn't understand until I researched. These guys in these bombers had unbelievable obstacles. First, taking up and getting up to altitude, it was freezing cold up there. They wore heat suits and they were connected with a line to a plug to warm their seat. They're probably sweating underneath. They also had communications. So they had a wire to a plug for that. At altitude, they had an oxygen mask and a third line. So they're tethered to the plane with 3 lines. So they can't really move around a lot. Bob had to move it around between the cockpit and the nose. So he had to unplug and plug in his 3 different lines, at least 3 different lines. So first they're dealing with freezing temperatures. It can get to minus 60 up there at altitude. Then over the target, they encounter the flak, which it's hitting the planes, knocking it out. Some direct hits would take a plane down. They would see their buddies that they ate breakfast with go down. So they've got the flak. So it's the freezing temperature, the flak. Then if they're lucky enough to make it through the target, they've got the fighters that are going twice the speed, and the gunners from the bomber are just trying to shoot randomly at the fighters so that they can get home. So they've got freezing temperatures, flak, fighters. Then when the fighters are shooting their 20 millimeter cannons or on their planes, they're shooting to kill. They're shooting through the thin aluminum skin of those bombers, and they might hit a hydraulic line. So the crew is fighting fires on board at the same time they're fighting. It was fearsome. It was fearsome. So if they were lucky enough to land at their air base, they get down there, they give them a shot of whiskey. Some of them take 2 just to calm them down from the day. And then they go walking toward their tent at the end of the day. They might pass an empty tent of the crew they ate breakfast with that morning. And that's got to be a surreal feeling. So they walk to their tent. They get ready to go to bed. They want to write a letter. These letters were sort of to decompress. It was sort of a lifeline back home. They just wanted to know who was dating who. They wanted to gossip. They would write 5-page letters. And then at the end, they would say, well, I guess I better close because I've got to go back upstairs tomorrow to the same horrors that they did. So in Bob's experiences, it was almost daily. And they had to try to decompress to make their lives normal.
And Jen, do you think, since you read so many of the letters, and are they trying to convey this experience to the people in Illinois? Are they trying to hide it from them? I mean, how
interesting you say that. So both John B. and Bob were the censorers. All these letters were censored back home. You know, you had to cut out anything that might be secret, you know, the Mediterranean, whatever, because they didn't know if the Germans were going to get the planes that had the mail sacks. So, but oftentimes I think John B. and Bob would let things go, and they would say, oh, I flew over the Colosseum today. And so I knew that meant they went over Rome. So I would go to the National Archives and find out, yes, that day, both of them went over the Colosseum. And so they did give little hints, but they always tried to make it, oh, this isn't so bad. You know, here, everything's okay. Don't worry about us. We're going to be coming home soon. I'm almost at my 25th mission, and I'll get to come home. Bob's experience when he went to the Mediterranean theater, he started out when he first got there. If he flew 25 missions, he had a ticket home. But while he was there midstream, they upped it to 35 and then 50. So when he went to Ploesti that second time, the odds of these guys, the odds of getting shot down were so high, they might not make it to 50. And they all knew that. And in the 8th Air Force, if you got past an 8th mission, you were lucky, because then it was an odds number. It was a matter of luck that determined your fate.
I have a question from Wally Morrison, and he asks, did either of your Navigator men fly along with or at the same time as George McGovern? And I don't know if you came across George McGovern in your research. He flew the Dakota Queen. Was he in the 455th Common Group, I think? Did you run across any connections there?
I didn't specifically. I've heard McGovern's name in the, I've read about it. I think was he in the 15th Air Force?
Not sure.
I'm not sure. Yeah, he was.
I don't know.
Flying out of Italy. I know that.
There was no direct contact with him. Jimmy Stewart was part of the 8th Air Force, and he had command over the 93rd Group. My uncle did not meet him because he was in North Africa before that. John B. was in North Africa before Jimmy Stewart was there, but he did get a chance to meet Doolittle. Just right after Doolittle's raid, John B. was on a training mission in New Mexico. I think they landed in Albuquerque, and a transport plane had come in from, I think, Chicago. And John B. went in to get a weather update or whatever, and he immediately recognized, he wasn't General Doolittle at the time, but he probably was getting up there, and had a great conversation with Doolittle. And he did write home about that conversation, which was helpful in putting that in the book, and that story's in the book.
It's your turn.
I think it's your turn.
One of the, again, I've spent a lot of time studying the 8th Air Force. I've been to some of the prison camps and whatnot. So I wasn't unfamiliar with that experience. But what really surprised me is I had never heard before about Operation Reunion. And tell us a little bit about that. It's fascinating.
Operation Reunion was a huge operation that nobody seems to know about. It was one of those that just went under the radar for some reason. So at the time, August 23rd, Romania's political system was in flux. The king did not want more of his people being killed. The prime minister, Antonescu, was one of Hitler's buddies, and so he sent all those Romanians to fight the Russian front. The king decided to go against Antonescu, and so one day there's a story about the day where he calls Antonescu to the palace. He secures him in the palace vault, and then he calls some other senior members of the political party, and he goes on the radio at night and says, we're changing sides. We're not going to be with Germany anymore. We're going to go with the Allies. The Russians were actually knocking on the door of Romania. The Russians were coming in at the same time they changed. So there's a whole lot of chaos going on. Meanwhile, the the Air Force goes, we got to get our guys out, because if the Russians get our 1,200 POWs, they might use them as pawns to get the B-29 design, because the Russians wanted that big bomber, and it, it was a new bomber. And so they, in just a matter of days, they came up with a plan to repatriate 1,200 airmen. And the plan was, while the Tuskegee Airmen flew cover over Bucharest Air Force or airfield in Bucharest, the Tuskegee Airmen, waves of 6 retrofitted B-17s would land at a time. 20 POWs would go into the wave of 6 B-17s with propellers spinning, engines going. Those guys would take off. Another wave of 6 would do the same thing. They would not stop their engines. They were going and take off. They did this in a matter of 3 days to repatriate 1,200 airmen back to Italy, to American air bases in Italy. It was an unbelievable, I don't know how they could do it in today's, with all the red tape and everything that they have to do to get through it. But they figured this out and had these guys back in 7 to 10 days, 1,200 men. And they didn't have cargo planes available at the time, so they had to use these retrofitted B-17 bombers that they could carry, 20 guys. And with the Tuskegee Airmen, they were worried that the Germans were going to get mad and do something, shoot or bomb by plane the airmen that were waiting to be repatriated at the airfield. So it was a lot going on in those last few days.
Yeah.
So that's why. Go ahead.
Oh, no, go ahead.
I was going to say, that's why this book covers from the beginning of Ploesti to the humanitarian repatriation of those POWs that had been shot down over Ploesti. I think 2,300 men were shot down over Ploesti.
Wow.
Throughout.
Last question for you as we're wrapping things up here. I'm wondering, when you pitched this book to your publisher, who did you suggest would be your target audience? I know you originally wrote the story for your cousins, but as you're approaching a wider audience, who did you say, well, the meat of our audience is this group here? I'm just wondering what you said to them.
So that was the hardest thing, because I'm a woman. I wanted to know a little bit about the war. So I wrote it from the perspective, I think it's a softer side of a history book. It's written sort of like a historical novel, but it's true. It's I had my editor did a book for George Bush, and she was very particular that I sourced everything. She would not let me use anything that was not perfectly sourced from a primary source. I first had to get an agent who pitched the publisher. Of course, men will want to read this because there's a lot of training. Most books skip the training, before, like the navigation training or the stateside training where they would do fake bomb drops. I wanted to include that because I had it with the letters. Interesting. I think my target market is men and women, young men that are in their 30s that want to read World War II. It's a fascinating time, our age, all of our age. And I think women especially, it's, most World War II books are written for men. And I think they look at it at that target. But I think women have fathers or grandfathers or uncles that served in the war. And I think this is a story about all airmen. It just happens to be about John B. and Bob. And they went through a lot of the things that other airmen did. So, that's an open-ended question. I didn't give you an answer. Everybody should read this book.
There you go. Good. That's a good answer.
But I think that one of the things that's really true about this book is you explain everything, right? You don't have to go in with, you don't have to be a World War II aficionado to understand what's going on in your book. Jan Cress Dondi, thank you so much.
Thank you so much
for joining us on History Happy Hour.
Good luck with everything.
To chat about your book, which is called The Navigator's Letter, the true story of 2 World War II airmen, a doomed mission, and the woman who brought them together. So somebody asked us what happened to John B. We're just going to leave that mystery.
Buy the book.
Table. You got to buy the book.
That's right. Read the book and cheers.
Right.
I'd love to hear anybody that reads the book. I'd love to hear what you have to say.
Okay. Well,
Excellent. Please.
thank you so much. And hang on, we'll say goodbye to you off the air, but hang on a moment, but we're going to let you go here now. So, Chris, next week.
Next week.
Where are we going to be, Rick?
Well, next week. Okay, next week's show
Yeah.
is the day before my 40th wedding anniversary.
Wow.
And
So you're busy.
There's stuff going on,
You're
and
busy.
I am going to be busy. So we're going to have an encore episode,
Yeah.
which is going to bring back our friend James Mills from
Oh, yeah.
Australia to talk about his book, In the Days of Billy the Kid.
Outstanding.
We interviewed him, I think, 6 months ago or so, and this is the second time he was on the show, and he was great. So we'll be glad to have him back to talk about that. And the week after that, I want to have you guys all pencil this in, which I think is June 7th. We're
Mm-hmm.
going to have our D-Day special.
Yep.
And I know we're going to have on Joe Belkowski.
Which is worth the price of admission.
I know, and John McManus.
Yep.
And maybe we'll have a surprise guest as well.
Mm.
I don't know. And
me.
and
Yeah.
Chris, who's incredibly knowledgeable, which I really had brought home to me on this trip. So I really appreciate that. So, guys, thank you so much for joining us today. Please subscribe to us on YouTube, follow us on Facebook, shout at us on Blue Sky, listen to our podcast, back us on Patreon, and browse historyhappyhour.com.
Thanks, everybody. Stay safe.